Yes, welcome everyone. And joining me today, I have academic and terrorism expert, Professor Beatrice de Graaf. Welcome, Professor. The former ambassador of Turkey and now the chairman of Turkish think tank EDAM, Tajan Ildem. Welcome, Tajan. Yeah. And executive director at Ifri, Dr. Marc Hecker. Welcome, all of you. Let's jump right in. Beatrice, help me out, because when I look around at the world and I see wars, coups, climate change, disasters, meltdowns, where does terrorism really rank on that threat list? And I guess, what are we really talking about when we talk about terrorism in a NATO context?
Yes, there's a couple of questions. First of all, the Dutch threat assessment for terrorism was published last week, and it still stated that terrorism is on level 4, that's the utmost last level, and it's substantial. So it's not that much that terrorism perhaps has abated, but it's that other military conventional threats
what else is on that list?
Sorry?
What else is on that list?
Well, the terrorism threat assessment is on terrorism, but it ranks the level of threat within the country, within Europe, as within a context, and it says that the level of jihadist terrorism, ISKP, for example, is still the possibility of returning foreign fighters. That's the province of Khorasan, IS, that's being established in Afghanistan when the Americans left after 2001, and they staged numerous coups in Germany, in Russia, attacks, and also people in the Netherlands were arrested. Then there's right-wing terrorism, but I think with regard to NATO, what we perhaps should discuss is the fact that we had that for a couple of decades still, but it stepped up. 2 states who could be considered the sponsors of terrorism. The European Parliament in 2022 deemed Russia a terrorist threat in the sense that it commits brutal attacks in Ukraine, but also supports acts of sabotage and supports perhaps even right-wing terrorism attacks in Western Europe. And we also have Iran, and Iran also supports proxy terrorist organizations, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas. So these are 2 states that, on top of the non-state terrorist actors, also proliferate the use of terrorism. And that tackles NATO.
Okay. And in terms of how we position ourselves, let's focus on that threat, on that dual threat at the moment. What would you say, Marc, in terms of positioning NATO?
Well, first, I would say that the world has changed over the past years. I mean, now we have 45 minutes to speak about terrorism and the whole summit. A few years back, it would have been almost the whole summit dedicated to terrorism. So basically, we shifted from a strategic cycle that was named the Global War on Terror to another strategic cycle dedicated to strategic competition and linked, of course, to the threats on the eastern flank to Russia. So it's a different world, but as Beatrice said, we still have a terrorist threat and we have to deal with it. If you look at the Global Terrorism Index that was published a couple of months ago, actually what it showed is that terrorism is now on the rise. It used actually to decline over the past decade, and now it's on the rise again in terms of the number of countries that are targeted by terrorists, but also in terms of fatalities. If you look at regions like the Sahel, it's clear that the dynamics of violence are amazing.
And what do you put down the rise to?
Well, there are a number of factors. First, the jihadist threat has never disappeared, and the ideology was still here, and there are numerous conflicts where these groups, whether linked to ISIS or linked to Al-Qaeda, are still very much present and even rising. Then, what's also striking in this Global Terrorism Index is that the number of terrorist attacks in Europe has almost doubled in 2024 compared to 2023. And if you look at my country, France, there were 9 terrorist attacks that were foiled in 2024, including 3 related to the Olympics in Paris. And over the past year, since July 2024, there were 5 terrorist attacks in France, with several people killed, actually, and 3 of them were linked to jihadists. 1 of them was linked to the war in Gaza, and 1 of them was linked to the far right. So you see that, I mean, the threat picture is pretty striking and worrying.
I mean, every loss of life is tragic, of course, but we haven't seen the sorts of mass terror incidents that we kind of unfortunately got used to a few years ago.
Yeah, one of the reasons is that there's no more sanctuary right now, no safe haven for jihadist groups. The sanctuary, the safe haven in Syria and Iraq was destroyed back in 2017 to 2019. So far, there's no new safe haven, but there are zones that are pretty worrying. Beatrice mentioned the Khorasan region in Afghanistan and around Afghanistan. It's a place where a terrorist group managed actually to plan and execute attacks abroad. So they managed to perpetrate a devastating attack in Iran in January 2024, and a few months later, another one in Russia, near Moscow. And since then, by the way, in France, the level of the threat is considered the highest level.
Highest level, yeah.
I mean, the threats vary per region. I'm curious, Tajan, in terms of the region where you're active, how do you perceive the terrorist threat?
First of all, if you let me, I bring NATO to the picture since we are discussing in NATO context what terrorism means, and we have to take the recent strategic concept of 2022 as a reference. And there are two main threats. One is Russia, the other one is terrorism. In all its forms and manifestations, it is a direct asymmetric threat to our citizens and for the security of allied and partner nations. For Turkey, which is a country that suffered enormously out of terrorism, we attach great importance for NATO to strengthen its capacities. In that respect, the new policy guidelines and action plan, which was endorsed by heads of state and government in last year's Washington summit meeting, is important to elevate our capacity to analyze the trends in terrorist activities, early warning systems, sharing of intelligence, and also our means to deter and defend against terrorism. Because I have to confess that for a long time at NATO, there was some sort of a clear distinction between deterrence and defense and projecting stability beyond NATO's borders. And terrorism was put in the second rubric, saying, well, if we engage with partners, that should be enough. It is not enough, because we need to incorporate fight against terrorism in three core tasks of NATO. Collective defense, conflict crisis prevention and management, and cooperative security, which relates to engagement with partners.
I see Beatrice, you're nodding furiously there.
Yes, I'm nodding because I'm agreeing with what you say, but I'm also nodding because it's something that we need to affirm within NATO, and which is not self-evident. Because if you look at the deterrence and defense facility against terrorism, we could talk jihadism, but I also would like to talk right-wing extremism. And then I would also like to talk Russia, because a couple of researchers, amongst some colleagues of mine here in the Netherlands, they identified only in the last year in Europe 40 sabotage attacks initiated, nudged by Russia, where the Russians work with criminal networks in Europe, with right-wing extremist organizations in Europe, and try to destabilize the alliance. But then they also support right-wing extremist parties, right-wing populist parties, and those parties are contentious within the NATO itself. In February, G.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, went to München, the Security Conference, and said NATO has to fight its enemies from within. And he didn't mean the right-wing populist parties, he meant the attacks against the right-wing populist parties. So he said we need to support the AfD, whereas the AfD in Germany has been deemed right-wing extremists to large extent, and Russia supporting them. So we find ourselves in a strange situation within NATO, that the main pillar of NATO, the United States, sees this threat slightly different perhaps very different from European countries.
And how on earth do you fix that? Because there are ideological differences on who even gets labelled a terrorist or not. So how do you fix that?
Marc, how do we fix it?
I don't know how we fix it, but you have a Turk and a Frenchman, so I guess it's a good reason to speak about the Kurds, for instance. So actually, we didn't fix the issue. The Turkish government considered the Kurdish groups, with whom several European and the US cooperated back when we were fighting ISIS. The Turkish government considered them as terrorists. And so it created diplomatic tension, but it didn't block everything. We managed just to continue, the fight against ISIS. At the end, we won, and we managed to overpass.
But that's the unity of the alliance in fighting ISIS. But how do you find the unity in fighting Russia and right-wing terrorism if the ideological divides are drawn within NATO
Well, this
itself?
is the problem. There was this ideological divide with respect to the Kurds between the Turks and the French.
But I think you touched upon a very sensitive issue. If the European Union and the United States agree on a list of terrorist organizations, that includes PKK, that also includes offshoot organizations, the extension of PKK like PYD, YPG in Syria. And we know that for practical reasons, the United States at that time decided to cooperate with PYD, YPG in fight against ISIS, Daesh, and they said that it would be tactical, temporary, and transactional. But since 2013 up till 2025, what kind of temporary status we can talk about? So what I'm trying to emphasize is that if allies are not eye to eye on definition of terrorists, then it may hamper unity and cohesion among allies. It's a big risk. Therefore, allies should be sensitive to the sensitivities of other allies in their fight against terror, because we cannot qualify terrorist organizations, good terrorists and bad terrorists.
Yeah, but
there should be a full
it makes
agreement.
Being sensitive to the sensitivities of others and their sensitivities, it starts to become a very difficult political game to be played. What do you see? What's the way through this kind of quagmire?
Well, I'm first going to make it even a bit more complex, and then I'm going to try to issue a couple of ways to go ahead. Well, first of all, fighting terrorism is not NATO's main prerogative, and fighting terrorism should be something that should be done within the rule of law, within the civil domain. So it should be done by the police organizations, the justice organizations, Europol within the EU, and not by the military. So that being said, NATO can do something, for example, in identifying the threat of sabotage acts that are coming from Russia. Because the Russian military service is behind that, allegedly, the GRU, and there we need all the intelligence efforts of all the countries that make up NATO to work together. You could also point to Iran. We haven't discussed Iran yet, but in the Netherlands last year there was an attack staged by Iranian agents where 2 Iranian dissidents in the Netherlands were murdered. And there have been attacks in previous years as well, done by Iran. And Iran and Russia both make use of criminal gangs or criminal proxies in Europe. So that requires both the criminal law paradigms, and then every country can have its own sensitivities. But if we work together as a military alliance, you could start by sharing intelligence. And colleagues of mine have said that, for example, take the amount of money that you spend on one F-35, use that for counterintelligence, and you can step up tremendously your efforts in identifying the threats of those state-sponsored terrorist proxies.
So does this speak to capabilities? We need to, we're talking about spending more money on defence, but actually we should, within that discussion, we should be spending more money on counter-terrorism.
Well,
counterintelligence.
On the point that Beatrice raised, I agree that the resilience of individual nations, which relates to North Atlantic Treaties Article 3. And this article is as strong and important as Article 5. It's a national responsibility, and certainly law enforcement agencies do have a role to play. But we cannot just say NATO does not have any role to play in its capacity to bring in fight against terrorism. I think it is wrong, because let us not forget that for the first time in its history, NATO invoked Article 5 because of terrorism, and deployed forces.
In relation to where, sorry?
The war on terror, Article 5 in Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Yeah. But then with Iraq, it also introduced, America, the United States also introduced the semi-legal definition, which wasn't legal at all, of enemy combatants. So my point is NATO should be very careful in venturing into that domain of creating new legal categories. That is something that a law enforcement agency should do. So that is why I stress counterintelligence more than law enforcement within the NATO remit.
I agree with you on that, but what I'm trying to emphasize is that we cannot just say terrorism is responsibility of individual allied nations through their law enforcement agencies. NATO can incorporate fight against terrorism in all core tasks of the alliance, including deterrence and defense. And it requires 360-degree approach. And I very much applaud Secretary General Rutte. Today, he emphasized 360-degree approach because sometimes we have the tendency to focus too much on one region, neglecting the threats and challenges emanating from the other region.
Where do we focus too much, do you think?
I would be careful in using the term terrorism about Russian sabotage. I mean, I'd rather use hybrid warfare and put it in a different category. And
I cited the European Parliament.
Yeah, I know that.
Yeah.
I know that, but I mean, as academic, it's also a problem when you link terrorism to a state, because it's, well, there are state-sponsored, it exists,
Iran.
but here it seems more to be some kind of intelligence operation perpetrated by state agents. So institution focusing on the right threat and not to mix everything. And plus here, I think that we have an important focus, and I understand why, on the eastern flank. And if you also use terrorism for the eastern flank, then you may also run the risk for getting the southern flank.
That's true, but the Dutch General Intelligence Agency and the National Coordinator for Counterterrorism and Security last week published this threat assessment in which a whole chapter was devoted to the threat that Russia is sponsoring terrorist organizations from the right-wing spectrum in Europe. So I'm not saying that Russia is a terrorist nation. I quoted the resolution by the European Parliament that it does conduct acts of sabotage and also sponsors terrorism. And then the intelligence service of the Netherlands and of Germany concluded that Russia is supporting right-wing extremist organizations. Allegedly, the leader of the base, it's the right-wing extremist organization of which minors in the Netherlands were apprehended, is allegedly a Russian spy. So there is a linkage. So why can't you say that?
Well, it blurs I mean, it's different if an organization is funded and logistically helped by a country, rather than when it's really an offshoot created by a foreign intelligence agency. I mean, everything is complicated and blurred, but I guess that as academic, we are also useful to policymakers when we manage to have clear-cut category and explain in what ways we can deal with and fight each category with different tools.
And for which category would you think, because that's a question that I have myself, how does the NATO enter into this field? And that's why I brought up Russia and Iran, because that's linked to military conflicts, and that's where the NATO does have a role, more than I would say in going after domestic terrorism.
Well, it can be in intelligence sharing, for instance.
Exactly, yeah.
If we boost our capacity to share more intelligence, because intelligence is a national asset. And to the extent that it is shared among allies, it will strengthen their capacity to counter terrorism. And I think the recent action plan adopted by heads of state and government in countering terrorism may help nations to strengthen their capacity, but it all depends on political will, as we were discussing
and about balancing interests. Like you alluded to it just then, in terms of some regions being more exposed to the threat of terrorism than others. Is there consensus on the fact that, you know, even though one country is perhaps less exposed, we need to be spending as much money to help countries that are exposed?
Well, some countries are more interested in certain zones than others, but the purpose of an alliance is to try and build some consensus. But if you look at those zones, I mean, for instance, we mentioned Afghanistan and the Sahel. The problem is, what can we do? We tried to do a lot. Look at the history of Afghanistan. I mean, it's a failure for NATO. I mean, I'm sorry to say that publicly here, but I think it's a failure.
Yeah, if NATO as an expeditionary force goes after terrorists, it's very difficult to achieve
for
success.
that, of course, NATO's engagement with partners is one topic of discussion in this panel. So far, NATO has been engaging with its southern partners, and it will continue doing so. I recall the report prepared by an expert group and presented to the Secretary General, and it was discussed at ministerial level. It shows in which areas, and terrorism is definitely one topic in that elaborate report, how NATO could boost its cooperation with partners, not only Mediterranean Dialogue and Istanbul Cooperation Initiative format, but also with Sahel countries, because we cannot isolate North Africa from the problems of Sahel. I mean, there is an intrinsic link between those regions. And if there is instability, if there is economic underdevelopment, it creates a fertile ground for non-government armed organizations, and including terrorists, to flourish.
I agree with that, but if you look at Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, I mean, we lost them. Now they turn to Moscow.
To the Russians, yeah, precisely.
To Russia, and the most active IS provinces are active there, also in
And what was that down to? I mean, you know, a common criticism is that organizations, or Western organizations, fail to pay enough attention to local dynamics, culture, religion, and that you lose the hearts and souls of local people, and that's why they end up turning to, for instance, Russia. So what went wrong?
Well, there was a lessons learned report done by NATO on Afghanistan, and I want to read one sentence. Future NATO train, advise and assist missions should carefully consider the political and cultural norms of the host nation and the ability of that society to absorb capacity building and training. That's exactly what you said. I mean, we are not able to analyze the local culture and to adapt to their needs. And
well, sorry?
Yeah, no, please do so.
Well, that is the problem, but there's another problem. Fighting terrorism as NATO, as a military alliance, is flawed. Because if you start an expeditionary operation, as in Mali, or as the Dutch also did in Afghanistan and Eurozone, and shooting starts to happen, and people thought we were there to bring peace and stability, and now our troops are being killed, and bombs explode. So in the Netherlands, a government was toppled in 2010 over a mission that was not, I would say it euphemistically, not very well understood by the Dutch parliament. So fighting terrorism is something that only increases in time in the kinetic domain, and you cannot keep that up with popular support enough at home. France had the same problems. Germany didn't want to participate at all for that problem. So that's why I would say the fight against terrorism should not be militarily waged by NATO predominantly, but I would say it should be done by the countries themselves. And perhaps NATO can help them, like you say, invest in capacity and training. But also, if NATO loses itself in those expeditionary forces, we get the same problems that we had after Iraq and Afghanistan, with the black sites and the black ops.
It's sell at this moment, though, when everyone is talking about increasing defence spending. There's a kind of disconnect. People don't appreciate that you're keeping Europe safe by investing in counterintelligence and local partnerships there.
But I think it is not contradictory. If you invest on the capacity building of those countries in fight against terrorism, in fact, you are investing in to your own security and safety.
I'd like to bring in the audience at some point, but perhaps...
I just wanted to say that there's a difference between counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. And in Afghanistan, it was more counterinsurgency than counterterrorism. And in the Sahel as well. I mean, we have insurgencies, and at some point you have to acknowledge the threat that you face in order to adapt.
Yeah. Okay. Do we have any questions from the audience at this point? Yeah, we've got one there, any others, and one over there. Okay, first of all, if you could stand up.
I'm Rosina from the Netherlands Youth Atlantic Association. You were talking about like good terrorists and bad terrorists before about the Kurds. I was wondering, in Syria right now, there's a new leader who I think, like most people, classify him as a former terrorist. Do you think, like, what are your opinions on somebody, like, stop being terrorist, and then other countries working together with him right now and shaking his hand, and the European Union and most Western countries?
Thanks very much.
Well,
yeah.
Well, history is full of examples of that kind. I mean, one of the ways how terrorism stops is that the terrorists themselves turn political and they accept negotiations. And Yasser Arafat is a case in kind. He was put on the terrorist list, and then in 1971 or 2, he was invited for the Assembly of the United Nations. Gary Adams, Sinn Féin, the FARC. So there are numerous examples where organizations that had been on a terrorist list, ANC as well, had been on an international terrorist list, were then transitioning towards a political party. So it's doable, totally. And perhaps it's better for the peace, after all.
Marc?
I think there are three issues related to the new government in Syria. The first one is the ideological shift genuine? Will it last? Researchers, journalists have gone to Idlib for years, and they saw the evolution. They saw that HTS was different to ISIS. Now we have to see if it sticks for several more years. The second issue is HTS was able to do counterterrorism in Idlib. Will it be able to do it in the whole country? And we know that ISIS is still a threat. And look at the recent terrorist attack that struck a church in Syria very recently.
Damascus.
And in Damascus, yeah. And the third question is, we can imagine that the answer will be negative, that it's very hard to control such a territory. And so the next question is, will this government agree to cooperate with Western countries that do CT there? And the coalition against ISIS still exists. And the answer here seems to be yes. So those are, for me, the three key issues that need to be monitored over the next months and years.
Great. Yeah.
And in any case, until such time then we see terrorist organizations lay down their arms and finish their activities targeting others, we should be united in classifying those organizations who we decided to keep them in the list of terrorist organizations. Otherwise, there will be a discrepancy in the way we handle those terrorist organizations, and it will also be detrimental to the unity and cohesion among allies.
Yeah, but I mean, you said it yourself with the example of the Kurds. I mean, there seem to be ideological differences on how that group will be labelled, and I don't see it in the short term, at any rate.
No, but
unity on that.
it was labeled as terrorist organization, but for transactional and tactical reasons, there was a support given to those groups who were affiliated with PKK in fight against ISIL.
And if I may add one layer of complexity, if you look at all the NATO member states, there are probably hundreds of their citizens that are still held by the Kurds in the northeast of Syria. So this is not an issue dealt with by NATO, but it concerns NATO countries.
Yeah, okay. Let's go to the next question. Yeah.
Hi there, my name is Alex, and I've just got a question, because we talk about kind of, what can NATO do to combat terrorism, but it should not be much more of a socio-economic talk as well. So much of the reason why does terrorism happen is for socio-political reasons, especially in the Middle East. With Daesh, with Al-Qaeda. So, is military action the answer? Would that not just fuel more terrorism in the future?
Thank you very much, Professor. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for that question. The assumption you made is that socioeconomic root causes are behind terrorism. Within the academic world, that has mostly been debunked. So it's mostly not big macroeconomic, socioeconomic root causes. They do not help. They facilitate or they stop, but they're not the causes, and they're not a predictor for terrorism. So in the Middle East, you do have to stress the proliferation of apocalyptical, eschatological, extremist beliefs by organizations like Hezbollah, Hamas, also Jewish organizations, Iranian organizations. So they trigger and they form a narrative to which people rally. So only the socioeconomic, to remove those grounds is not enough. That's important. Still, that makes your point valid. What can NATO do if it's mainly about narratives, if it's about injustice? And that's exactly my point. NATO should collect intelligence, should work with the alliance members in fighting insurgencies. The Houthi rebels spring to mind, perhaps Hezbollah. But NATO should be very careful, because lots of what we do in countries themselves won't be accountable. It won't fit within the law enforcement framework, and that's bad for legitimacy. We saw that happening in Afghanistan and Iraq. That didn't help.
But don't you also agree, just to pick up on that point, that there is a kind of disproportionate focus on the military route and the counterintelligence and counterinsurgency route than focusing on socio-economic
But that doesn't
uplifts?
That doesn't.
You said it's not. Yeah, it's not data-wise. It's not the only predictor. But nevertheless, it's a factor. It's a factor.
A moderator, I would say. It's, well, now we're discussing politics in general. I mean, of course, I want to go government money to humanitarian aid and to good politics and a stable rule of law. But that's not the case. We're now discussing NATO, so that's the other way in carrying out this discussion. I just want to warn you, you cannot bomb terrorism away with any military means. Neither can you just say we have to invest loads of the developmental aid and it goes away. You need to start with the regimes, the governments themselves and their narratives and the way they open the floor for extremist beliefs.
Okay, clear. Do we have any more questions there? Yeah, one over here. Yeah. And one in the corner, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Laura Jasper. I'm a strategic analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. Thank you for a very interesting panel discussion. My question is actually going on about the topic of narratives, because we see that narratives is a very important discussion when we talk about terrorism. But something that also almost always comes up when talking about terrorism in combination with, well, now NATO, we're at the NATO Public Forum, is how quickly the waters become very muddy with terminology and categorization. There is military rule of law, there is civilian rule of law, there is terrorism, there is hybrid warfare, and everything kind of all comes together in a topic like this, in a panel discussion like this. So my question is, how much of the conversation changes when narratives is not necessarily the main driver behind terrorist organizations, but also opportunism? Just the opportunity of them to work together with perhaps a state entity or a state-affiliated entity. So the main driver not being ideology, but just merely the opportunity of terrorist organizations working together with a state entity to reach their means, whether that's an ideologically driven terrorist organization or even maybe an organized crime group that carries out activities that we could associate with terrorism. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, this is a very good question, and that's why I insisted that we should not make a distinction between good terrorist organization and bad terrorist organization. After all, they have means to cooperate amongst themselves. And for narrative, and you are absolutely right, that they are using different narratives, and now more and more they are using social media platforms. You are experts, you know better than I do, and they use it for propaganda, recruitment, for financial
a weapon, a platform, communication, a generator, recruitment, everything.
Yeah, everything. Yeah. So it is a major challenge. But going back to the previous question, I think you are right in saying that we cannot reach our objectives only with kinetical measures. Perhaps dealing with socio-economic problems of those regions is an issue for the countries themselves to take care about. But nevertheless, we have to recognize the fact that it creates a fertile ground for terrorists to reach out, and their messages resonate with wider audiences. Yeah. This is the challenge.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add a short comment. I heard several times the expression whole of society today.
Yes.
And when we speak about narratives and counter-narratives, I think it's a key expression, because one of the lessons learned of the past decade is that counter-narrative coming from organizations or from countries is not that efficient. It's much more efficient when it comes from civil society organizations or from citizens who just want to face...
Can you give an example of one that's particularly effective?
Well, I can give a counter-example, which is the official platform launched by the French government 10 years ago to tackle ISIS narrative, and it didn't work that well. But when the government understood that, they also funded civil society organizations to do this kind of job, but without the flag of the government, and it actually worked better.
Okay. It should be responding to the local sensitivities, right, in creating the narrative.
Yeah.
Locally tailored.
Plus, a common feature of several terrorist organizations is that they love conspiracy theories, and when it's government, flagged,
they
feel themselves.
Yeah. Okay, we had one more question over there.
Hi, thank you. My name is Rosita Džekova from the Center for the Study of Democracy. My question is related to the previous one, but it's much more practical and operational. Going back to the question of the overlaps between right-wing extremism, hybrid threats coming from Russia and state actors, but also criminal networks. How do you, we see already a hybridized threat environment, but institutions in Europe still operate in kind of these silos. This is counterterrorism, this is hybrid threats. How do you see, how should institutional infrastructures evolve? And can you name a good example where there is already breaking of the silos in terms of addressing this type of threat? If you can name a good practice or a forecast how we should evolve, how institutions should evolve to counter this type of threat.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for bringing it back to, I think, one of the main threats to NATO as an alliance, that is Russia, that's trying to sow discord and undermine the alliance. And it does so in various ways, with hybrid, with cyber attacks, but also by weaponizing right-wing terrorist organizations, as is a whole chapter in this report that came out last week. And one thing that we can do, and European countries stepped that up during the times of IS in the Caliphate, France has played a major role in that, and the Netherlands as well. So set up a kind of a hybrid organization where intelligence representatives from 27 EU countries work together. It's not direct intelligence sharing, because that's not allowed, but they were able to communicate quite quickly with each other. And Europol is also a case in point. So you could set something like that up within the European countries of NATO vis-à-vis Russia, with the United States. And of course, things already are happening on that plane. But since it's connected so much to the narrative, to intelligence, to discourse zone, to the online world, recruitment, you need to counter it on that level as well.
But you can build up something like that very carefully, and it can be an effective organization, and then a statement from, let's say, like a J.D. Vance-style statement about the AFD can drive a bus
very
through
disruptive.
that.
Yeah.
So what's your hope when it comes to kind of that, those sorts of...
Well, you heard me mentioning the European countries within NATO. So I think, like the European countries now, with Turkey, have to invest in defense and deterrence more amongst themselves. Also have to do that in the field of intelligence.
Yeah. And in the did you have something?
No, there was one more question in the audience, but I don't know if we'll have time.
I don't think we've got time, unfortunately. I don't think we've got time. But just to bring it back to this conference, I mean, on this topic, taking an idea like that, you know, the creation of a hybrid intelligence, counterintelligence organization, whatever, across states, what would be an ideal outcome with respect to fighting or effective counterterrorism here at the summit? What could be said, or what could be done, what could be agreed?
Well, I think last year's Washington summit outcome is solid enough for countries to be guided by. Of course, we may have the best policy document, but it all comes to political will and implementation. And it requires sharpened focus, I guess, on the part of allies to get united, not only in deterring and defending challenges and threats emanating from the east, but also those from the south, and to intensify coordination and cooperation among allies, but also between international organizations. And NATO, the United Nations, and EU can cooperate more in this.
So we don't have to reinvent the wheel, take that policy document and just intensify collaboration and cooperation.
And the whole of society approach, raise awareness in society. That's why we're here, to discuss this.
Yeah. So what would you like to see in concrete terms here?
I would like to see people take that risk of states like Iran and Russia sowing discord here more serious.
Yeah. And what would that look like in practice?
That if something happens, like the murder of the Iranian dissidents in the Netherlands last year, or the right-wing extremists being supported by Russia, that it's not discarded as just an incident, but that it's considered as part of a weaponizing of terrorism against the West, that people really recognize that.
Okay.
Well, since it has connection with hybrid tactics and warfare, I think we should also emphasize the need to strengthen societal resilience and whole of society approach.
Yes.
Okay, and very briefly, because the music has started, Marc, so we're being...
So let the music play.
Beautiful, but I'm not going to let you off the hook. What would you like to see, very briefly, at this summit?
Well, I would like to see a longer spot on terrorism issues next week.
Okay. All right, very clear. Well, thank you very much for being brief. That's it for now, everyone in Studio Bravo. Thank you very much to all of my guests. I'm in desperate need of a cup of tea to process everything we've just heard. So do hang on in the live stream to watch Studio Alpha, where 2 US senators will soon talk about burden sharing from a US perspective. Back to you, Donna.